And now we get into chapter 2 of F.A. Hayek's The Constitution of Liberty. A chapter in the book that is different from what we've read up till now and is what probably Hayek is the most famous for. Right? F.A. Hayek, long before he wrote this book, is famous for his talking about knowledge and about information in society. And in this chapter here, we get his argument for that. I don't think it's the strongest version of the argument. I actually don't like it quite a bit. I may do another video talking about how I think this could have been put better or in a different way, or how maybe I would have put it. And I'm getting stuff from Hayek. I'm just getting stuff from Hayek in different books than this. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to summarize what I am reading Hayek as saying here. I'm going to be leaving out things that I think are very important because I think Hayek leaves out things that I think are very important. But I'm going to try to do my very best to summarize what Hayek actually says in this chapter in this book. So here are the main things Hayek talks about. He talks about ignorance. He talks about that in a couple different places. He talks about conscious and unconscious knowledge. He talks about the transmission of knowledge. He talks about how that those first three things come together to give us a case for liberty. And then finally there's an epilogue where there are a couple other important ideas that we'll talk about at the end because he spends a bit of time on them. All right, so first let's talk about ignorance. So Hayek is the staunch advocate of this thing I love that I'm going to call radical humility. Hayek's got this idea here and everywhere else that, hey, we don't know what this part of society is for or does, or what this thing is, or what this thing does. Let's not mess with it because we don't have that sort of knowledge. Not only that, we don't know why this person is doing what they're doing or why they might choose to do that thing. They might have a very good reason. And it's impossible for us looking down from above to know what reasons people may or may not have. So unless we have a very good reason, it's better to leave well enough alone because we're ignorant. And so he starts this chapter off talking about Socrates, saying, hey, Socrates was right. The wisest thing we can do is just to admit how little we know. And so he starts to talk about ignorance. Now he says it's kind of hard to talk about ignorance because we're talking about something that we literally don't know. But we can talk about certain things about it. We can talk about where it begins and where it ends, what specific things we don't know, what specific things we do know. We can talk about what sorts of thing ignorance includes, etc. Surprisingly, he doesn't talk too much about all of that here. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about conscious and unconscious knowledge, but something he does say about ignorance that I find very interesting is that as knowledge grows, ignorance necessarily also grows for two reasons. So one of those two reasons is that as knowledge grows, we get more information with which we can better word questions, right? Before we had quantum mechanics, for example, we didn't know that we would need to ask, how should we interpret quantum mechanics, and give 4 or 5 or 12 different theories of how it should be interpreted. We didn't know before the Michelson-Morley experiment that we needed to ask the question of, is light a wave propagating through the medium of space or not? Like what is going on there? So as we learn more facts about the world, we have better language to ask more questions that we were unable to answer before. Second reason that ignorance necessarily grows as our knowledge of things grows is because the relative proportion of all possible knowledge that you can have as knowledge grows gets smaller and smaller and smaller. In today's world, somebody who's a total expert on every fact about optics ever has no time to learn or study anything else whatsoever, which wouldn't have been true even 100 years ago. In today's world, in order to gain expertise on something, the knowledge is so big that you have to study that one particular thing. And so it's impossible for any one person, the bigger knowledge gets, to have anything more than a tiny minuscule sliver of that total knowledge, which is why it's important, what we're going to talk about next, that non-conscious knowledge and dispersed knowledge across people is a possible thing, and that you can benefit from knowledge that you don't actually hold in your own head. So Hayek talks about conscious explicit knowledge, which I might call CEK, C-E-K, because I'm going to be saying it a lot, versus other non-conscious explicit knowledge. So there are three types of KEK. So first, scientific knowledge is clearly a part of KEK. Everything that we learn about the external, visible world is information that we can consciously hold in our minds. It's explicit and worded in a very particular way. Some non-scientific knowledge is part of KEK. There's information that you can know about the external world by observation or by some other method that is not good to systematize, right? You might have particular information about the fishing conditions in the Merced Creek on a particular day, but that might not be information that lends itself very well to systematization at all. It might not be something that you want to systematize or that would be worth systematizing, but it's still very real, conscious, and explicit knowledge. Thirdly, there's expert knowledge. So it's not knowledge about things, but knowledge about how to find out information about things. So you might have a scientist who doesn't know a lot about some particular field, but maybe he's an expert on experimentation and how to set up experiments, and so he has expertise on how to get that information if it is needed. Librarians, for example, are not experts in any particular subject of knowledge. They're experts on how to find out information that you might otherwise need. And so that might not be all of conscious explicit knowledge, but those are examples of conscious explicit knowledge that exists in our minds. But there's other knowledge that isn't conscious and isn't explicit. And so Hayek defines this broader way of thinking about knowledge as all human adaptation to the environment into which past experience is incorporated. So every time there was a past experience that caused a human adaptation to the environment, that makes us better at dealing with the environment, that is knowledge, even if it's not something we consciously and explicitly hold in our minds. So for example, language, habits, culture, institutions are all things that we have developed, or certain specific types of tools over time that we can use, that are adaptations to our environment, adaptations to interacting with one another, but without holding any particular knowledge or information in our minds. So like if you're talking about institutions, you can talk about corporate structure, you can talk about the family structure. There are these things that we do, but we have no idea why we do them or why they're useful. I mean, maybe if you're a sociologist, you study why they might be useful. But really, the total function of these things is not something we can know with any particular certainty, is basically how Hayek's argument goes. And he thinks that these particular things, habits, skills, emotional attitudes, were chosen over time by selective elimination. So the primary mechanism he uses in this entire chapter is selective elimination. It's very guided by this sort of biological evolutionary narrative where you try multiple different things. Some of them work, some of them don't. The ones that work are selected for. The ones that don't work are selected against. All right, so moving on to the next topic. How is knowledge transmitted from person to person? So there are all these different sorts of knowledge that we use. Some of them are conscious and explicit. Others are not conscious and explicit. The conscious and explicit knowledge is only in some people's minds. It might be in very, very few people's minds. But that knowledge is transmitted to the rest of us through various mechanisms. Now, he doesn't actually talk about prices in this chapter at all, which are probably the most famous. I mean, I think he makes an oblique reference to it once, but prices are the most famous example of information that other people have that's transmitted to you without you having to know it. And this is all stuff that comes from Hayek. And I feel like he really needed to include more of these, not necessarily examples, but other mechanisms beyond simply this biological mechanism of, if something works, people will adopt it. If something doesn't work, people will reject it and not adopt it. And so we should just try as many different things as possible. Anyway, two types of transmission of these ideas can occur. So there's transmission over time. So you have our generation now who discovers something new, who alters our institutions, who does this, that, or the other thing, and that knowledge is transferred to the next generation somehow. So there are mechanisms that do that. Secondly, there's transference of information among contemporaries, which is what he says he's going to focus on most in this chapter, and he'll focus on the transference of information across time to future generations in another chapter. So when you're transmitting information among contemporaries, the question is, how is current experience utilized to help those not taking part in that particular experience? So your knowledge about fishing in Merced Creek, how is it possible for that information, that knowledge, if you use it in a particular way, that use of yours transmitting effectively the information to other people so they act as if they knew it, even though they don't? So how does this create a change for liberty in Hayek's view? Well, it creates a case for liberty because whenever there's a change in our environment, like iron is now less available or the fish have all died or something like that, that change necessitates a shift in either our institutions or in our constellation of resources and how they're put together and how they interact with one another, how they flow in and out of one another, and how they're put together to make different goods and the like. Without freedom, without the ability for someone to say, I am going to act on the information and knowledge I have, it is impossible for that information and knowledge to be transferred to somebody else. If we had someone who was omniscient, who knew all the facts about society, Hayek thinks the case for freedom would absolutely and utterly fall apart. There would no longer be any reason for us to have liberty because we'd be able to solve all these solutions with just reference to this one person's knowledge of all of this information. But because we don't have that, we need, when a change in our environment occurs, to allow different people to try out different solutions to that problem. So you're going to need a very particular set of skills, abilities, attitudes, resources in order to solve any one particular problem. And so by fostering across society all of those differences between people, you maximize the chances and the probability that you'll have someone who will come up with a solution. So you have all these people in all these different places trying solutions to a problem. One of them comes up with the solution to the problem, and then everyone else adopts it because they see that it works. But you need to have freedom for all of these differences to develop and cultivate and occur, and freedom for people with these differences to try different solutions in order to get the correct solution in the first place. Now, Hayek thinks there are a couple things about this that are really important to notice. So one of them is that for any particular freedom that's going to result in this sort of groundbreaking breakthrough that will solve these problems, that's not a freedom that many people will take advantage of. It's probably a freedom that very, very few people will take advantage of. But that's fine because it benefits everybody when a solution is found. So we shouldn't judge whether a freedom is necessary or not by how many people will take advantage of it, but whether it'll be useful freedom to solve problems or not. But you can't know whether a freedom will be useful to solve problems or not in the first place. If you knew that, then you would know the solution to the problem, and you could simply do the solution and get rid of the freedom. So you have to allow all these different freedoms to solve for up to now unforeseen problems and to allow for solutions to them. Because if you get rid of those freedoms, you won't have the ability to come up with those sorts of solutions. So the final thing you need to keep in mind, and we'll come up with a second video to do the sort of epilogue that he has and talks about in this chapter, is you need to understand that the freedom that's necessary here in order to solve problems isn't simply freedom of speech and intellectual freedom. It really is economic freedom, the freedom to actively try different solutions, not just to think about what will work and what won't work. Because again, we don't necessarily have the means to come up with a solution, what will and what won't work, simply with academics. Instead, we need to have freedom to do and to act and to potentially try things without even having an idea of why they might work. Just allow people freedom, and you will probably, by allowing all of this different variety to operate, get a solution to a problem that's useful and that works. And economic information is very, very different from academic information. One thing that he mentions here that's pretty interesting is that even our academic and scientific information, you can't predict ahead of time what it's going to produce, right? When you do an experiment, you don't know what the result of the experiment is going to be. That's why you do the experiment in the first place. So you can't predict the outcomes and roads that these are going to have. And a lot of the time, science isn't focused on providing real solutions to problems. Instead, science comes behind technology. A solution has already been created, and science comes to explain why that solution worked. If you actually look at most scientific research and how it's done, which is something that's great to see here in this chapter brought up. All right, we'll have one more short video talking about kind of the interesting, weird stuff he talks about at the end, and then maybe we'll have a video with me commenting on certain things about this chapter that I just think that I didn't like very much. All right, thanks.